You feel fine. That's the problem. You wake up every morning, go through your routine, maybe notice your pants fitting a little tighter than they did 6 months ago, but you brush it off. You tell yourself it's just bloating, just stress, just the way your body is changing with age. And that reasoning feels completely logical because you do feel fine. You're not in pain. You're not collapsing. You're functioning. But here is what nobody tells you, and what most people don't find out until it's dangerously late. The fat that is quietly killing you doesn't show up on the outside first. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for you to notice it in the mirror. It grows in silence, wrapping itself around your most vital organs, strangling your liver, squeezing your pancreas, inflaming your arteries, and doing all of this while you stand on a scale that says your weight is perfectly normal. This is visceral fat. And the terrifying truth is that millions of people are carrying dangerous amounts of it right now, today, with absolutely no idea. By the time most people realize what's happening, years of silent damage have already been done. So ask yourself honestly, how would you even know? Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. Visceral fat is not the fat you can pinch. It is not the soft layer sitting just beneath your skin that you see when you look in the mirror. That fat, the kind you can grab with your fingers, is called subcutaneous fat, and while it may be cosmetically frustrating, it is largely metabolically harmless. Visceral fat is something entirely different. It lives deep inside your abdominal cavity, packed around your organs like a biological time bomb, and it is one of the most metabolically active tissues in the entire human body. That last part is critical because most people assume fat is passive. They think it just sits there, stored energy waiting to be burned. But visceral fat is not passive at all. It is constantly secreting hormones, inflammatory compounds, and chemical messengers that directly alter how your body functions at a cellular level. It disrupts insulin signaling, it drives chronic inflammation. It interferes with your liver's ability to process toxins and regulate blood sugar. It contributes to high blood pressure by releasing compounds that constrict blood vessels. And it does all of this so gradually, so quietly, that your body adapts to the dysfunction and your brain registers it as normal. That is the cruelest part of this condition. You adapt to feeling worse and you start to mistake that diminished state for who you simply are now. Now here is the cliffhanger that should stop you from clicking away, because what I'm about to explain in this video are not the obvious signs. Anyone can tell you that a large belly means visceral fat. That's surface level information that helps no one. What we're going to talk about are the subtle, early, and almost universally overlooked warning signs that your body is already sending you right now, signals that most people completely misread or explain away with perfectly rational sounding excuses. And once you understand what these signs actually mean, you will never look at them the same way again. Stay with me, because one of these signs might be something you experienced just this morning. Let's begin with something almost everyone has felt, but almost no one connects to visceral fat accumulation. Persistent low-grade fatigue that doesn't respond to rest. Not the kind of exhaustion you feel after a bad night of sleep, because that goes away when you finally get a full 8 hours. This is the fatigue that is still there after a good night's sleep. It's the fog that settles over your thinking by early afternoon. It's the way your motivation seems to evaporate before noon, even though you've had coffee. Most people blame this on aging, on stress, on being busy parents or overworked professionals. But what's actually happening on a biological level is far more specific. Visceral fat releases inflammatory cytokines, particularly interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly into the portal vein that feeds your liver. Your liver, suddenly flooded with these inflammatory messengers, begins to produce C-reactive protein and other systemic inflammatory markers. Chronic low-grade inflammation of this kind is profoundly draining to the human body. Your immune system is partially activated all the time, running in the background like a program that's eating up all your processing power. Your mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles in your cells, begin to function less efficiently under chronic inflammatory conditions. The result is an energy deficit that no amount of sleep entirely corrects, because the root cause isn't how long you slept. It's what's happening inside your abdominal cavity while you sleep. Connected to this fatigue is something that tends to appear a little later, but is just as frequently dismissed: brain fog and difficulty with sustained concentration. People describe this as feeling like they're thinking through cotton wool. They forget where they put things more often. They start sentences and lose the thread. They read the same paragraph twice. They walk into rooms and can't remember why. Society has normalized this so thoroughly that we've created an entire vocabulary of jokes around it: senior moments, mommy brain, Zoom fatigue. But what the research increasingly shows is that visceral fat accumulation has a direct neurological consequence. The inflammatory compounds produced by visceral fat cross the blood-brain barrier. They trigger neuroinflammation. They reduce hippocampal neurogenesis, which is your brain's ability to form new neural connections. They disrupt the function of the prefrontal cortex, which governs focus, decision-making, and working memory. What this means is that the cognitive decline many people attribute to aging or stress is, in many cases, driven substantially by what is happening metabolically in the abdominal cavity. Your brain is not failing because you're older. In many cases, your brain is struggling because it is being systematically inflamed by fat you cannot see. Then there is the blood sugar symptom that almost no one catches in its early form. You eat a meal, and within an hour or two, you feel an overwhelming need to eat again. Not mild hunger, real, urgent, distracting hunger, sometimes accompanied by irritability or lightheadedness. You might think this means you didn't eat enough, or that your meal wasn't filling, or that you simply have a fast metabolism. But what's actually happening, particularly when this pattern is new for you, is something called postprandial glucose dysregulation. Visceral fat is intimately involved in insulin resistance. Because it surrounds the pancreas and liver, it interferes with the liver's normal response to insulin, causing the liver to continue releasing glucose into the blood even when insulin signals it to stop. Meanwhile, the pancreas begins producing more insulin to compensate for the resistance. This cycle of blood sugar spikes followed by compensatory insulin spikes and rapid glucose crashes is experienced as hunger, urgency, and irritability just a couple of hours after eating. People self-diagnose this as hypoglycemia or a fast metabolism and respond by eating more frequently, often choosing higher carbohydrate foods that accelerate the cycle. They never suspect that the true driver is inflammatory visceral fat distorting their metabolic signaling. Here is something that connects visceral fat to a symptom most people have never once associated with body fat: elevated resting heart rate and the sensation of your heart pounding harder than it should for minimal exertion. You walk up a flight of stairs and your heart is working noticeably harder than you think it should. You carry groceries from the car and you're slightly breathless. You stand up quickly and your pulse surges. Most people chalk this up to being out of shape, to not exercising enough. And while physical deconditioning is a contributing factor, the less obvious driver is what visceral fat does to cardiovascular physiology. Visceral fat releases free fatty acids directly into the portal circulation, which travel immediately to the liver and promote the production of small, dense LDL particles, the most damaging form of cholesterol for arterial walls. Simultaneously, the inflammatory cytokines from visceral fat promote arterial stiffness, meaning your heart has to generate more force to push blood through vessels that are losing their elasticity. Your resting heart rate climbs because your cardiovascular system is working harder under baseline conditions. When you exert yourself even mildly, you notice it immediately because your cardiac reserve, the buffer between resting and maximum effort, has quietly narrowed. Another sign that virtually nobody connects to visceral fat is disrupted sleep, specifically waking up in the middle of the night or sleeping what seems like enough hours but never feeling rested. Sleep disturbance is so common in modern life that people rarely investigate its cause beyond stress and screen time. But visceral fat has a direct relationship with sleep quality through two mechanisms. The first is physical. Excess visceral fat increases intra-abdominal pressure, which pushes upward on the diaphragm and can contribute to sleep-disordered breathing, including mild obstructive sleep apnea in people who don't snore dramatically enough to be formally diagnosed. The second is hormonal. Visceral fat disrupts cortisol regulation. In people with significant visceral fat accumulation, cortisol rhythms become dysregulated, with cortisol remaining elevated in the evening when it should be declining, making deep restorative sleep harder to achieve. And here is where the cycle becomes vicious and nearly impossible to escape without understanding it. Poor sleep drives visceral fat accumulation. Sleep deprivation increases ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and decreases leptin, the satiety hormone. It raises cortisol, which directly promotes visceral fat storage. It impairs insulin sensitivity. So visceral fat disrupts sleep, and disrupted sleep promotes more visceral fat, and this loop continues silently, invisibly, for years. Pay close attention to what happens to your mood, because visceral fat has a relationship with mental health that is only now beginning to be fully understood. Specifically, there is an increasingly documented connection between visceral fat accumulation and the prevalence of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability that doesn't have an obvious psychological trigger. People who develop these mood changes frequently seek help from therapists or psychiatrists and receive diagnoses and treatments that address the psychological symptoms without ever touching the underlying metabolic driver. The gut-brain axis, the communication highway between your intestinal microbiome and your central nervous system, is profoundly disrupted by visceral fat. Visceral fat alters the composition of gut bacteria in ways that reduce the production of serotonin precursors and short-chain fatty acids that support neurological stability. It promotes a state of gut dysbiosis that sends pro-inflammatory signals through the vagus nerve directly to the brain. The result can be a persistent low mood, heightened anxiety, emotional reactivity, or a general loss of the capacity to experience pleasure, what clinicians call anhedonia. When someone says they've been feeling off for no reason, when they describe themselves as more irritable than they used to be, when they notice that things that used to bring them joy no longer do, visceral fat may be a primary metabolic driver of exactly that experience. There is a digestive warning sign that is almost always misattributed. Bloating, specifically the kind that wasn't there before, the kind that makes your abdomen visibly distend by late afternoon even though you ate relatively normally, the kind that comes with discomfort and a sense of fullness that lingers. Most people diagnose themselves with food intolerances, with IBS, with too much gluten or dairy. And while these may play a role, visceral fat causes significant disruption to gut motility and gut microbiome composition that manifests as exactly this kind of chronic, unexplained bloating. Visceral fat increases intra-abdominal pressure, which slows gastric emptying and alters the mechanical function of digestion. It promotes an inflammatory environment in the gut lining that compromises the intestinal barrier, the phenomenon researchers call increased intestinal permeability. When your gut barrier is compromised, bacterial endotoxins called lipopolysaccharides enter the bloodstream and trigger systemic inflammation that, among other effects, further disrupts gut function. The bloating you've been blaming on bread may actually be your gut signaling that something far more systemic is happening inside your abdominal cavity. Now consider the skin. Your skin is a remarkably sensitive metabolic organ, and it reflects internal conditions with surprising specificity if you know what to look for. One of the early skin signs of visceral fat accumulation and the insulin resistance it drives is a condition called acanthosis nigricans, the darkening and thickening of skin in skin folds, the back of the neck, the armpits, the groin area, sometimes the knuckles. Most people who notice this assume it's a hygiene issue or a skin condition and attempt to scrub it away. It doesn't scrub away because it isn't surface dirt. It is a direct tissue response to chronically elevated insulin levels. When your cells become insulin resistant due to visceral fat disruption, your pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Chronically high insulin levels stimulate skin cells called keratinocytes to proliferate excessively, and they stimulate melanocytes to produce more pigment. The result is patches of skin that appear darker and have a velvety texture, particularly in body folds. If you have noticed this on yourself or someone you love and dismissed it as cosmetic, please understand that it is your skin telling you, in the clearest language it has available, that insulin resistance is already underway. Hormonal changes that people attribute entirely to aging are frequently being driven or dramatically accelerated by visceral fat. In men, visceral fat contains high levels of an enzyme called aromatase, which converts testosterone into estrogen. As visceral fat accumulates, men experience a progressive decline in free testosterone accompanied by an increase in estrogen. The symptoms of this shift include decreased libido, loss of muscle mass despite maintaining activity levels, increased breast tissue sensitivity, or even mild gynecomastia, reduced motivation, decreased competitive drive, and emotional softening in ways that feel unfamiliar and disconcerting. Men frequently attribute these changes to stress or getting older without recognizing that an increasingly large visceral fat depot is biochemically feminizing their hormonal profile. In women, visceral fat disrupts estrogen metabolism and is a significant driver of the hormonal dysregulation underlying polycystic ovarian syndrome. It worsens the symptoms of perimenopause. It contributes to irregular cycles and increased PMS severity. The hormonal symptoms that many women are told are simply part of being a woman are frequently metabolic consequences of visceral fat that are both measurable and addressable. Blood pressure changes are among the most overlooked early warning signs precisely because most people only have their blood pressure checked occasionally, and a reading in the slightly elevated range often gets dismissed with advice to reduce stress and cut back on salt. But visceral fat drives hypertension through multiple independent mechanisms that have nothing to do with salt intake. The free fatty acids released by visceral fat into the portal circulation activate the sympathetic nervous system, raising baseline heart rate and peripheral vascular resistance. The inflammatory cytokines from visceral fat directly damage the endothelium, the inner lining of blood vessels, reducing their ability to dilate appropriately in response to increased blood flow. Visceral fat also impairs kidney function by promoting sodium retention through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. If your blood pressure has crept from consistently normal into the slightly elevated or high normal range without an obvious dietary or lifestyle explanation, visceral fat may be the mechanism that nobody checked for because it doesn't show up on a standard blood pressure reading. It shows up as the cause of one. There is one more sign that is perhaps the most psychologically significant and the most broadly relatable. You have noticed changes in your body shape that don't match the scale. You may have maintained the same weight for years or even lost weight on a diet, but your waist measurement has increased or your abdominal area has changed its contour. Your pants fit differently around the midsection than they do in the legs. You notice what some people describe as their belly sticking out, even when the rest of their body looks the same. This is the physical expression of a body preferentially depositing fat in the visceral compartment, and it can happen even when overall body weight remains stable or decreases if you are losing lean muscle mass while simultaneously gaining visceral fat. This pattern, known as metabolic obesity, or what researchers sometimes call skinny fat or normal weight obesity, is particularly insidious because it passes completely under the radar of standard medical screening. A person can have a perfectly normal BMI, normal total body weight, and carry dangerous levels of visceral fat that will only be detected by waist circumference measurement, waist-to-hip ratio, or advanced imaging. If your waist circumference is above 35 inches as a woman or above 40 inches as a man, that alone is a clinical indicator worth taking seriously, independent of everything else on the scale. What should you do with all of this information? The first thing is to stop waiting for dramatic symptoms, because visceral fat rarely produces them until it has already caused significant damage. The second is to understand that visceral fat is not permanent, and it is not destiny. Of all the types of fat in the body, visceral fat is actually among the most responsive to targeted intervention. It is uniquely sensitive to specific dietary modifications, particularly reductions in ultra-processed carbohydrates and added sugars, which directly drive the insulin signaling that promotes visceral deposition. It responds powerfully to sleep optimization because correcting sleep quality is one of the fastest ways to recalibrate the cortisol and ghrelin dysregulation that visceral fat creates. Strength training has an outsized effect on visceral fat reduction relative to its effect on subcutaneous fat because building metabolically active muscle tissue directly improves insulin sensitivity and shifts the body's fat storage priorities. Chronic stress management matters enormously because cortisol is among the most potent biological drivers of visceral fat deposition, and people who carry high allostatic loads will continue accumulating visceral fat even with good diet and exercise unless the cortisol piece is addressed. Time-restricted eating windows show particular promise in early research for specifically targeting visceral fat because of the way fasting periods alter adipokine signaling and promote autophagy in visceral adipose tissue. The conversation that needs to happen in every doctor's office, every health consultation, every wellness conversation is not just what does the scale say, it is where is the fat, what is it doing, and what are the earliest signs that it's beginning to accumulate in dangerous places? The symptoms we've discussed today are not rare. They are not extreme. They are things that tens of millions of people are experiencing right now and explaining away with perfectly convincing narratives about stress, aging, busy lives, and genetics. Some of those narratives contain truth, but underneath many of them, undetected and unaddressed, is a metabolic condition that responds to intervention, but only if the intervention comes before the consequences become irreversible. You began this video feeling fine. Maybe you still do, but I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. How many of the signs we discussed today have you recognized in yourself, even partially, even in mild forms, even in ways you've already rationalized away? The fatigue that doesn't fully lift, the hunger that comes back too soon, the waist that has quietly expanded, the sleep that doesn't fully restore, the mood that has shifted in ways you've accepted as just who you are now. If any of those landed for you, even quietly, even uncomfortably, that recognition matters. That is your biology trying to communicate something important through the only language it has. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments right now. Which one of these warning signs surprised you the most? And have you been experiencing any of them without realizing what they might mean? I read these comments, and your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.